Gail, it's amazing to have you here. So I'm here with Gail Bradbrook, one of the co-founders of the Extinction Rebellion. This has taken off like wildfire, and for people like myself who've been working on climate for years, we always wondered, would this ever sort of get beyond a small clique? Would people ever really begin to understand what's at stake? And if I'm honest, I might have got to a point where I'd given up hope, and then suddenly Extinction Rebellion and then Greta Thunberg and the children's school strikes have suddenly taken off. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how that happened.
For myself, I started planning civil disobedience in 2010. It was clear to me then that it was needed. And trying to talk to people saying that's surely what's needed, and actually being ignored and people thinking, well, that's not really going to work, is it? That's not possible. And I got so frustrated that by 2016 I actually went slightly in desperation and prayed, which probably sounds a bit ridiculous, and controversially with psychedelic medicines actually. I prayed to have more information and to really find a team. I'd already set something up called Compassionate Revolution, and it seems like a miracle, but literally after that it did work. The prayers were answered, and I met Roger Hallam and I met other people, and we started to build a social movement called Rising Up. We were around for 2 years. It's very much based in social science. How do you build social movements? Roger did a lot of research at King's College. We've used something called momentum driven organising, so there's been a lot of hard work behind the scenes. So for example, we set up a website, we announced a rebellion, and every time anybody clicked like, we messaged them and we said, do you want to talk in your local community? So we've been out talking to people. It's been a lot of graft behind the scenes.
So it might have looked like it's come out of nowhere, but there's been, as I've heard, there's been a lot of planning that's gone into this.
Absolutely.
For common wisdom for a while has been you can't scare people. Yeah. If you tell people this is really bad, that we're facing a crisis.
So where did that wisdom come from?
People switch off.
Where do you think that wisdom came from?
Well, a good question. But we've tried the green miracle, and that hasn't worked on its own. And we've tried the sort of scaring people, or that's how it's been articulated, and that hasn't worked. So what's different this time?
So, just to answer my own question, because I don't know the answer, but Jane Morton has spoken about this. She's a psychologist in emergency mode messaging, and she has a suspicion that the climate deniers deliberately seeded that into our movement. We don't know, so we can let that one go really, but it's called emergency mode messaging. It's used by people trying to stop people using tobacco or to get them to use seatbelts or whatever. The idea is that if you tell people there's a really serious situation, there's something they can do about it, and they should act according to values, that people actually step up, and that in emergencies people are willing to step up, and that a different mode switches in. I think Roger Hallam sort of fell upon that partly by accident, and his intuition was that we had to tell the truth and ask people to act accordingly. What we brought in as well was, what I brought in I guess, was to tighten the science up, was to say that we actually need to hold a vision of what the change is. And also, I guess, a bit from the rising feminine, if we want to use that language, to say that grief was really important. And I don't know if you've spotted that, but our movement really encourages people to feel it. And it's almost the first action we say to people. Yes. So they go into this panic and they want to do something, and we say, the first thing to do is get with other people and feel what this feels like. Because people don't act on the basis of intellect generally.
Facts. It's emotion.
It's emotion, we know that. And literally, also revolutionary movements work when they have apocalyptic messaging, it turns out. Now this is real, we're not making it up. There is an apocalypse here and it's coming. Yes. So,
in a sense, it's, I've always felt that it's about fear and hope. If you give people fear but they can't do anything about it, if you give them hope, well, there's not really anything that gets them off their couch, in terms of the status quo. But in a way, you've given people fear, yes, because we have to be scared about this. But you've also given them hope in the sense there is something you can do, there's action that you can take.
I think that's the thing. I've become increasingly disliking the word hope. Derek Jensen, who's a deep green activist, calls it hopium. It's this idea that keeps you quiet, So I think what we're really talking about is what Joanna Macy calls active hope. The hope comes from doing.
Action.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not the kind of hope that says it's all going to be okay. We know that we're going to have massive loss. You know, it's already written in the physics, right, and in the ecology. But can we live good lives in the face of that? And can we shift how we operate as human beings? And what does it mean to live a good life in these times with purpose and with determination to turn this situation around as best you can? And there's a kind of single individual journey in that, which is a hero's journey for many people in Extinction Rebellion that suddenly go, yeah, I will get arrested actually. And I know that's not for everybody and it comes from privilege. But lots of people go through that individual journey. There's also a kind of collective journey of, I would call it a shifting consciousness, which is saying that in the face of this crisis, humanity has to do something different.
And I think one of the really things that I found most exciting about what you're doing is this idea of the people's assemblies. So where did that come from and how does that fit in, I guess, to taking action?
I think thanks for mentioning that, and I think the other thing to say about I didn't come from nowhere, this thing, is we're standing on the shoulders of people like you who went to Copenhagen, came back depressed, you know, people who stood on the front lines trying to stop road building, and you know, it's a long movement, the environmental movement and other social movements, right? So there's eldership. Now, one of the things in the eldership is the Occupy movement, and they did people's assemblies, right? So that has been brought in through people like Jamie Kelsey-Fry and others. What I'd like to say, I suppose, at that point is the more that people recognise there's an emergency, you kind of have this choice. This was named by the Dark Mountain people, Dougal Hine and others, that said you either move in the direction of less democracy, which is fascism, or more democracy. Like the democracy we've got right now is like clearly not working, right? Brexit mess and all the rest of it, it's in a crumble. So we have to move in more democracy. That's about people really understanding their own agency. Probably worth making the distinction though between people's and citizens' assemblies. Is that sort of clear to you?
No, explain that.
So a people's assembly could be run at any time, anywhere on the streets. Like I ran one spontaneously when people were following the pink boat out of Oxford Circus, determined not to let it go right. Like, okay, what are we going to do in this situation? So the decision making comes from whoever happens to be there. A citizens' assembly is a very different thing. It's like having a jury of about 100 people. The people are chosen by random sortition. It's a Greek form of democracy, and it would be representative of the demographic of the UK. And they're taught deliberative critical thinking skills, and they get to small groups. It's well facilitated and expertise is brought in. And it turns out that much better decisions are made that way because it's not lobbying, it's not corporatocracy or plutocracy and all that nonsense.
And that, so I was part of a panel of experts on the Extinction Rebellion stage at the Byline Festival a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you.
And which was an amazing experience. But that was followed by, I guess, if I've got this right, a
people's assembly.
A people's assembly, where it was facilitated. And after the people who took part in that heard the experts, they then took what the experts said on board and then deliberated and came up with suggestions. So that was part of the process. And are you going to be doing this across the country? Is the idea?
We did it throughout the rebellion in April, sometimes out of necessity given a particular circumstance, and sometimes to look at specific issues that come up when you're thinking about an ecological crisis. I would like to see there being people's assemblies across the UK talking about the constitution in the UK, because it's clearly not working for us, our broken political system.
Somewhat dated, I think, is what we're finding. So what's planned in October, and what are you hoping to achieve from that, and how can people be part of that, and how can people facilitate that to achieve a constructive outcome?
So we're back on the streets October the 7th. In the meantime, there's various actions, and we'll be supporting the school strikes as well. October the 7th for at least 2 weeks, we reckon. You can never tell. As we say, we're organising a rebellion, not a school trip. So the best way in for people is to join their local group, and there are many across the country, and come with their local group. You'll get training, you'll get inductions and so on. You can just join us on the streets, there's lots of inductions at the time. We'll be holding different spaces to April, we'll be holding more spaces. There's obviously a lot of weaving and thinking about the current political situation, but it's very much about holding the government to account. And the other piece of this is what we're trying to build, what we're calling a movement of movements. So there are other movements where we have commonalities, but we may not be in direct agreement on every point. we're going to be joined on the streets, for example, by Animal Rebellion, who are very much focused on animal rights and the sort of veganism and that kind of thing. And, you know, from my perspective, a largely plant-based diet is clearly the direction we need to move in, but an Animal Rebellion will be holding that as from a different perspective. You know, there'll also be farmers on the streets, so I think there's an interesting play there. You know, some of whom may be arguing for regenerative agriculture, including ruminants. So, and in both parts of those movements, the people I've met are super lovely people. I'm not expecting a bonfire or anything like that. We have to have grown-up conversations, don't we? There's the peace movement joining us on the streets. There's environmental justice organisations and so on.
So, the community that I'm part of, finance, and which is a subset of business. What role can business play? Because there was a letter from a lot of business leaders during the first strikes or rebellion back in April.
Yeah, I got in a lot of trouble for that.
but obviously business is part of society.
Totally,
and finance and people. There are people in businesses and there are people in financial institutions, I guess, who are rebels within those organisations. What role can they play, as part of the bigger picture?
Well, from my perspective, businesses ought to be things that get things done, right? In the simplest form. And I think things like Frederick Laloux's work, where you see the emergence of teile businesses that are led by purpose, and profit is something that may or may not happen, but the purpose is the most important thing. I think for businesses to move into that teile space is really, really crucial. Self-management, vulnerability, and purpose-driven. And if your business is at odds with the current, climate and ecological crisis, then you need to really question whether you want to stay in it, in my opinion. I would also personally argue... Change it, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm by no means any expert, but one presumes oil companies that are good at building oil platforms could be good at building offshore wind, or whatever. So,
well, I think that's one of the big... Actually, that's a good point, because one of the biggest success stories, and it's just one of many, but is many of those North Sea oil and gas engineers have now become offshore wind engineers. In fact, the UK's offshore wind industry is now bigger, despite a lot of the government trying to sort of prop up that offshore oil and gas industry and support it. The offshore wind industry is bigger, and many of those people who worked in that have now retooled themselves. So I mean, it is. I think it is entirely.
I mean, I think personally, what we have to start saying is that the economic, political, cultural, legal operating system that we're running, I almost don't. I mean, it's obviously neoliberal capitalism, but one could argue that it's not even working as it's supposed to be. In fact, Milton Friedman interestingly said that free markets would never concentrate power and therefore no harm would be done. 8 people owning the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. Something's going badly wrong in the operating system that we're running, and it's killing life on Earth. And I think the most important thing that businesses should do, which is why arguably that letter was the wrong thing at that time, I think it was, in terms of it wasn't radical enough, is that businesses need to name that, business leaders and ministers should be criminalised if they create mass damage and ecocide destruction. That's one thing I'd like to see. That this operating system is not working for us. We have to have a different one. And I don't mean an ideological fight. I'm fighting for team socialism. Let's have a grown-up conversation about what we can take of what's good and what we create that's new. In that way, I'm personally in favour of a mass debt strike coming off the back of October.
But even in this, even in the system as it is, as imperfect as it clearly is, even in this neoliberal system, the clean technology, wind, solar, is cheaper than fossil fuel technology increasingly everywhere, yet it is still not taken off at the speed it needs to.
Well, I mean, I can't remember the exact figures, but the UK is the worst in Europe in terms of subsidies. It massively subsidises fossil fuels and minimally subsidises renewables. That's not cool. But I am personally very convinced that we can't just simply switch what we have now onto green technologies. That requires way too much extractivism in terms of global south countries, in terms of like, you know, precious metals and all the rest of it. I think we do have to move to a situation where we consume less. You know, we have a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. This is not just a switch to renewable technologies. So that's why our citizens' assembly that we're calling for is both about climate and ecological justice. You know, it has to look at all those issues, because even if we went totally to green technology and that didn't destroy the planet, you know, the fact of how we're using up water, polluting the air and the seas and the water, ocean acidification, soil depletion, it's all coming from the same root cause, in my opinion, which is like that we see the planet as something where you can just take things and then just dump it, you know, as if it's this infinite space. And we know we need to mimic nature more and be in cycles more. And I guess what's exciting is that, you know, as much as people might have different emphases out there, there's loads of solutions. There's loads of people who said, you know, zero carbon Britain, or Ellen MacArthur talking about, you know, circular economies, or donut economics from Kate Roll, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of thinking out there. It's just literally the lack of political will. And we know from social science, and I think Extinction Rebellion has now proven this, if you want to see change happen, you've got to disobey. You've got to be disobedient. So I would like to see business leaders breaking the law as business leaders.
Well, that's an interesting point to stop. Gail, thank you so much. And I'm so happy you're going to be part of our panel tonight, the Green and Tonic. And remember to subscribe to the channel. And we're going to have a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.